The iron hull of HMS Erebus screamed. It was not the sound of a ship sailing, it was the sound of a coffin being nailed shut. September 1846, latitude 70 degrees 5 minutes north. The Arctic was no longer a map to be conquered. It was a predator that had finally clamped its jaws. 129 men, the pride of the British Empire, stood on decks that would never feel the roll of the open Atlantic again. They were trapped in a white purgatory of grinding pack ice, frozen fast in the Victoria Strait. Sir John Franklin looked out from the bridge, but he did not see a passage to the Orient. He saw a vast, unblinking eye of white that had been waiting for them since the dawn of time. The verdict was passed. The sentence was execution. Every man on board was already a ghost. They simply had not stopped breathing yet. Pressure was the only constant. The ice, a solid sheet of granite-hard seawater 15 feet thick, was moving. It groaned with a tectonic hunger, squeezing the reinforced oak ribs of the ships until the massive beams splintered like dry twigs. Inside the hull, the sound was like a gunshot in a cathedral. Every crack was a countdown. The temperature outside had plummeted to -40 degrees, a cold so absolute it turned exhaled breath into shards of ice that cut the lungs. 129 men were breathing the same stale metallic air, trapped in a wooden box that was slowly being crushed by a continent. There was no escape. There was no rescue. To the Admiralty in London, they were heroes. To the Arctic, they were merely calories wrapped in wool and vanity. The first signs of the collapse were not the ice, but the food. In the dim light of the lower decks, the men huddled around tins of preserved meat. 8,000 tins, the latest marvel of Victorian technology, was supposed to be their salvation. But the solder used to seal them was lead, pure, gray, silent poison. With every meal, the crew was ingesting death. It started as a metallic taste on the tongue, then a dull ache in the joints, then a creeping fog in the brain. The lead was leaching into their blood, turning elite sailors into paranoid, staggering wrecks. 18 months in, the physical decay was accelerating. Gums turned black. Old wounds, healed for decades, began to reopen. They were rotting from the inside out, while the ice waited to finish the job from the outside. Sir John Franklin sat in his cabin, surrounded by silver plates and fine china. He was a man of progress, yet he was utterly helpless against the primitive brutality of the North. He could hear the men coughing in the darkness, a wet, rattling sound that filled the corridors. The coal was running low. Without heat, the walls of the ship were coated in a thick layer of frost. Men slept in frozen hammocks, their blankets stiff with frozen sweat. 129 lives were being measured in the remaining bags of coal and the dwindling piles of lead-tainted tins. The silence outside was the most terrifying thing. It was a silence that stretched for 3,000 miles in every direction. By the end of the first winter, the first graves were dug, not in the earth, for there was no earth, but in the permafrost of Beechey Island. 3 young men, Torrington, Hartnell, and Brain, were the first to receive the verdict. Their bodies were lowered into the frozen ground, their eyes wide and staring, preserved by the cold in a state of perpetual shock. They were the lucky ones. They died while there was still prayer, while there was still a semblance of naval discipline. They died before the hunger became a physical entity that lived in the stomach like a parasite. The rest of the crew watched the burials with a hollow envy. 126 remained. Each of them knew they would never see the green hills of England again. The expedition was no longer a voyage, it was a slow-motion massacre. The ice did not just trap the ships, it broke the spirit. The Arctic summer of 1847 never arrived. The ice did not melt. The sun hovered low on the horizon, a pale, heatless disk that mocked their suffering. They waited for a lead to open, for a crack in the white desert. It never came. The ships remained tilted, held in the crushing grip of the floes. 24 hours a day, the sound of the ice grinding against the hull reminded them that the ocean wanted them dead. 129 men, and not a single soul was safe. The lead poisoning was now inducing hallucinations. Sailors spoke to shadows. Officers argued with ghosts. Captain Francis Crozier of the HMS Terror saw the truth. He watched Franklin's health fail, saw the way the commander's hands shook. Crozier knew the math of survival, and the numbers did not add up. The men were becoming irritable, their nerves frayed by the constant vibration of the ice. 129 men, and the air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, sickness, and the metallic tang of blood. The Arctic was a cathedral of white, and they were the sacrifices. Every day the ice pushed them further south, toward the desolate shores of King William Island, a place where even the wolves struggled to survive. The first part of the tragedy was ending, and the horror was about to begin. The ships were no longer sanctuaries, they were prisons. The coal was gone, the candles were short, the light was dying. On June 11th, 1847, Sir John Franklin died. He died in his bed, spared the final indignity of what was to come. He left 128 men behind him in a frozen wasteland, without a leader and without hope. As the flag was lowered on the frozen deck of the Erebus, the ice gave a massive, thunderous heave. A new crack appeared in the hull, and freezing water began to seep into the lower decks. The men stood in the dark, water rising around their boots. The ships were dying. 128 men were left to face a choice: die in the dark or walk into the white. The decision was made in the spring of 1848. The ships would be abandoned. 105 survivors prepared to step onto the ice. They packed the lifeboats, but not with just food. In their lead madness, they loaded the boats with heavy, useless treasures: silver platters, mahogany desks, and stacks of books. They were going to drag thousands of pounds of Victorian vanity across the roughest ice on the planet. They didn't realize the Arctic had already stripped them of everything. As they lowered themselves onto the jagged surface, the wind picked up, screaming like a banshee. 105 men stood in a line, harness straps over their shoulders, ready to pull their own coffins. The first man to drop didn't even scream. He simply fell forward into the slush, his heart stopping from the shock of the exertion. No one stopped to help him. They couldn't. To stop was to freeze. They began the long walk south, toward a river that was too far and a hope that was too thin. Behind them, the ships sat silent, skeletons pointing at a godless sky. The men did not look back. They only saw the backs of the men in front of them, and the endless, blinding white. 105 men remained. 105 targets for the hunger. 105 souls about to learn what a human becomes when the blood turns to ice and the mind turns to meat. The march was a funeral procession. They were dragging the boats over pressure ridges 20 feet high, hacking at the ice just to move a few yards an hour. The lead in their bones made every step an agony. The scurvy made their legs swell and turn purple. Every night, the cold crept in, stealing life from the edges of the group. Each morning, there were fewer men to pull the ropes. They left the bodies where they fell, black shapes against the white. They were moving toward the Great Fish River, a destination that existed only on a map they no longer trusted. The Arctic watched them move, a slow, agonizing crawl of dying ants across a frozen plate. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Crozier looked back. They weren't sailors anymore. They were shadows. They were walking corpses, held together by nothing but the habit of obedience. The wind howled, a mocking laughter that drowned out their labored breathing. There was no more talk of England. There was only the sound of the sledges creaking and the relentless, soul-crushing cold. They were entering the heart of the silence, and in that silence, a new sound was beginning to grow. The sound of teeth grinding and the dark realization that the only food left on this frozen earth was the man walking beside you. The Admiralty had sent them out with enough silver to feed a small city and enough pride to drown one. Even as the wind stripped the skin from their faces, the officers of the Franklin expedition clung to the delusion that they were still in England. In the mess of HMS Terror, Captain Francis Crozier watched the candlelight flicker against the mahogany paneling. They were eating from fine bone china while the world outside died in a scream of white. This was the fatal decision, the refusal to adapt. They had seen the Inuits, the savages as the men called them, wearing furs and eating raw seal fat. But the British sailor was a creature of habit and wool. They wore their heavy pea coats that soaked up moisture and froze into suits of iron armor. They refused to learn how to hunt in the frost, believing that their thousands of tins of soup would see them through. It was not just the ice that was killing them. It was the suffocating weight of Victorian arrogance. By early 1848, the lead poisoning was no longer a subtle ghost. It was a loud, shrieking madness. The solder from the tins had leached so deeply into their systems that the hierarchy of the ship began to dissolve into paranoia. Men looked at their superiors not with respect, but with a twitching, nervous dread. Why were they marching south? Why were they dragging a 28-foot whaleboat across the jagged ice? The boat alone weighed 800 pounds, and they had loaded it with another 2,000 pounds of useless luxuries. They were hauling iron stoves, boxes of religious tracts, decorative handkerchiefs, and heavy lead-lined chests filled with the officers' personal libraries. It was a monument to vanity, moving at a pace of 2 miles a day. Every mile cost a man. Their legs, blackened by scurvy, groaned under the strain. The connective tissue in their joints was literally dissolving. To an observer, they would have looked like a line of ants trying to move a mountain, unaware that the mountain had already won. Crozier tried to maintain the illusion of command. He insisted on the morning inspection. He insisted that the men shave, even as the razors tore through skin that refused to heal. He thought that if they kept the form of the Royal Navy, the substance of their lives would follow. But the men were changing. Their eyes were becoming sunken, yellowed pits. The lead induced a specific kind of cognitive collapse, a slow-motion shattering of the ego. Sailors began to wander away from the main group, walking out into the blizzard with a calm, terrifying smile, never to return. They weren't just dying of cold. They were losing the ability to understand what cold was. The arrogance of the empire had told them they were masters of nature, but nature was now stripping them down to their most basic, terrified elements. The naval uniforms were rags. The gold braid was tarnished black. The food situation turned from a concern into a nightmare. They opened tin after tin, only to find the contents putrid, a black slime of botulism and lead. The marvel of technology was a biological weapon. As the hunger sharpened, the men began to eye the sled dogs, then each other. There was a specific moment, documented in the flickering shadows of the tents, when the first officer realized that the discipline of the Queen was the only thing preventing them from tearing each other apart. But discipline requires calories. Without fuel, the brain cannot sustain the concept of duty. They were 105 men moving through a landscape that offered zero support. No trees, no soil, no mercy. Just the endless flat glare of the sun on the ice that burned their retinas until they were half blind, stumbling through a white fog of their own making. The fatal decision was reinforced every time they reached a fork in the ice. Crozier, desperate to reach the Great Fish River, pushed them harder. He ignored the signs of total physical collapse in his junior officers. He believed that the British will was an infinite resource. He was wrong. The will is a chemical process, and their chemistry was poisoned. The arrogance of believing they could carry the comforts of London into the heart of the Arctic was their true death warrant. They could have traveled light. They could have abandoned the boats and tried to live off the land as the locals did. But that would have meant admitting that the empire was not universal. It would have meant admitting that a savage knew more about the world than a Royal Navy captain. And so they pulled. They pulled until their hearts burst. They pulled until their lungs filled with fluid. They pulled until the silver spoons in their pockets felt like lead weights, dragging them into the grave. The arrogance extended to their maps. They were following charts that were more imagination than geography. They were looking for a passage that didn't want to be found, in a sea that was only liquid for 6 weeks a year. Every step they took south was a step further into a trap. They were moving into the most desolate part of the Canadian Arctic, a place the Inuits avoided during this season for a reason. There was no game here, no caribou, no seals, just wind and stone. Yet the officers continued to record their progress in logs with steady hands, as if they were reporting on a Sunday cruise in the English Channel. All well, the notes said, even as the man writing them could no longer feel his feet. This was the psychological shield of the Victorian era. If you do not acknowledge the horror is not real. But the ice did not care about their denials. By the time they reached the northern tip of King William Island, the group was a fractured mess of the dying and the insane. The boat sledges were now stained with the blood of those who had collapsed while in the harness. The arrogance was finally beginning to crack, replaced by a raw, primal fear. They started to discard the treasures. First, the books, then the stoves, then the extra clothing. The trail behind them was littered with the debris of a civilization that had failed. A silver hairbrush here, a copy of the Bible there. It was a trail of breadcrumbs for a rescue party that would never come. They were 105 men, and the silence of the Arctic was now louder than the wind. It was the silence of a tomb. The final arrogance of Part 2 was the belief that they still had time. They camped for days to rest, not realizing that every hour spent stationary was an hour of muscle tissue being consumed by the body for heat. They sat in their tents, shivering in a damp, freezing cold that no fire could touch, discussing what they would do when they reached the safety of the Hudson's Bay Company outposts. They talked about promotions. When hovorili pro medali, they were dead men discussing their futures. The transition from Part 2 to Part 3 is marked by this realization. The inevitable has moved from a possibility to a physical presence in the room. The arrogance is gone, replaced by the first cold, sharp taste of the point of no return. They were no longer explorers, they were prey. And the hunter was not a beast, but the very environment they had tried to civilize. The illusion of the British Empire died in the summer that never came. By June 1848, the sun was a mocking pale eye that refused to melt the iron-gray floes. The 105 men were no longer a military unit. They were a stumbling column of shadows, drifting across the skeletal limestone of King William Island. The pressure was no longer just the ice. It was the weight of 1,000 miles of nothingness pressing against their skulls. Fear, sharp and cold as a razor, began to replace the lead-induced fog. They realized, with a soul-crushing clarity, that the Admiralty was not coming. No smoke on the horizon, no white sails, just the endless rhythmic thud of their own failing hearts. The mistakes were now irreversible. Every pound of silver they had chosen to drag instead of extra pemmican was a nail in their collective coffin. The Great Fish River was a ghost, a line on a map that felt increasingly like a fairy tale told to children before they were abandoned in the woods. The physical collapse was gruesome. Scurvy had moved into its final, most brutal stage. Old scars from floggings or childhood falls, held together by the body's constant maintenance of collagen, simply dissolved. Men watched in horror as their own skin literally unzipped. Gums swelled into purple, rotting masses that overflowed their mouths, making it impossible to chew the rock-hard, lead-tainted biscuits. Every step was a gamble with physics. Their joints were so brittle that a simple trip resulted in a shattered femur. Those who could no longer walk were left behind. There were no dramatic goodbyes. A man would sit down to adjust his boot, and the column would keep moving. To look back was to invite the same fate. By evening, the man would be a white mound in the distance, a frozen statue staring at a sun that provided no warmth. Psychological decay followed the physical. The silence of the Arctic began to scream. In the absolute stillness of the tundra, the sound of a man's own blood rushing through his ears became a roar. They began to hear things. The phantom tolling of London's bells, the laughter of wives who had long since stopped expecting their return. Some men, driven mad by the lead and the isolation, stripped naked in the middle of a blizzard, their brains misfiring and telling them they were burning up with heat. This paradoxical undressing left the trail littered with frozen pale corpses that looked like discarded marble statues. They were no longer a crew, they were 105 separate islands of agony, connected only by the hemp harness of the sledges that cut through their wool coats and into their raw, suppurating flesh. Every decision made by the remaining officers was a frantic attempt to outrun a shadow. They abandoned the larger boat sledges, leaving them like stranded whales atop the ridges of ice. Inside these boats, the items left behind told the story of their insanity. a set of heavy silk curtains, a collection of theological essays, and a box of intricate lace. They were shedding their identity, piece by piece, but they were doing it too late. The energy required to drag those useless icons of civilization for 50 miles had already consumed the last of their fat reserves. Now, their bodies were eating their own muscle. Their hearts were thinning, their organs shrinking. They were becoming hollow men, husks of bone and grit, propelled forward only by a primal, lizard brain reflex to keep moving south. The fear of the other began to manifest. They were convinced they were being hunted, not by bears, but by something worse. The great white silence seemed to have a consciousness. Every time a fog bank rolled in from the frozen sea, the men huddled together, muskets trembling in their skeletal hands. They fired into the mist at shadows that weren't there. They were wasting their remaining strength on ghosts. This was the escalation of pressure, the realization that the environment wasn't just indifferent, it was actively hostile. The wind didn't just blow, it searched for the gaps in their rags. The cold didn't just nip, it waited for them to close their eyes. The mistakes of the past, the pride, the lead food, the heavy boats, had accumulated into a debt that could only be paid in blood. The turning point of Part 3 was the discovery of the first Croziers camp by a scouting party. They found a tent where 6 of their comrades had stayed behind. When the flaps were opened, there was no one left to rescue. The men inside had died in their sleep, but they didn't look like men anymore. They looked like leather stretched over bird bones. The sight broke the last remnants of the crew's resolve. If the strongest among them had withered into this, what hope was there for the limping, the blind, and the delirious? The fear was no longer a frantic emotion. It was a heavy, cold sludge in their veins. They stopped talking. The only sound was the wind and the rhythmic, wet coughing of men whose lungs were filling with the fluid of congestive heart failure. One evening, a group of Inuits appeared on the horizon. For a moment, there was a spark of hope. But the British officers, even in their terminal state, could not bridge the gap of their own prejudice. They saw the hunters as scavengers, and the Inuits, seeing a line of walking corpses with blackened faces and bleeding eyes, retreated in terror. They recognized the death shadow on these strangers. They refused to trade, for what could you give to men who were already dead? This was the final irreversible mistake, the rejection of the only people who knew how to survive this hell. The sailors watched the Inuits vanish into the white, taking with them the last possibility of salvation. The silence that followed was the heaviest they had ever known. As they pushed further onto the southern coast of the island, the geography itself seemed to conspire against them. The shore was a jagged wasteland of broken rock and treacherous ice. Every mile took twice as much effort as the last. The lead poisoning was now causing total renal failure in several men. Their skin turned a sickly, translucent yellow. They were living in a waking nightmare where the sun never set, but the world was getting darker. The pressure was at its peak. They reached a place now known as Starvation Cove. The name was not an exaggeration, it was a prophecy. They looked at the expanse of water between them and the mainland. It was choked with ice. There was no way across. The night at Starvation Cove was the end of the officers' control. A group of sailors, led by a man whose eyes were wide with a frantic animal light, broke into the remaining medical stores. They weren't looking for medicine. They were looking for anything that would numb the pain. They drank the medicinal alcohol, the laudanum, and even the toxic liniments. By morning, half of them were blind or dead. The remaining 80 men looked at their leaders, and for the first time, the Sir was dropped. The hierarchy, the last thing that made them British, evaporated in the sub-zero air. There were no more orders. There was only the hunger. Part 3 ends not with a bang, but with a horrifying, quiet realization. Captain Crozier, standing on the shore of the cove, watched as a small group of men huddled around a body that had dropped an hour before. They weren't preparing a grave. They were holding knives. The knives were not for defense. The first cut was made in total silence. No one protested. No one looked away. The fear had finally turned into something else, something older and more terrifying than death. The transition was complete. They were no longer the Royal Navy. They were no longer explorers. They were a pack. And as the first piece of meat was shared, the sky turned a bruised, ugly purple, and the first true blizzard of the season began to scream across the rocks. The point of no return had been crossed. The march was over. The feast of the damned had begun. The transformation was absolute. By the end of 1848, the men of the Franklin expedition had ceased to be British subjects. They had become ghosts haunting their own starving ribs. The discipline of the Royal Navy, once a rigid cage of iron and oaths, had dissolved into a primal, predatory silence. This was the point of no return. At a place later named Hunger Bay, the last shreds of the social contract were burned away. The betrayal was not a single act of violence, but a collective agreement to survive on the only fuel left in a land of stone and ice, each other. The first incision into human flesh was not done in a frenzy of madness, but with the cold, methodical precision of a surgeon. They used their naval saws and bone knives to disarticulate the limbs of their brothers, stripping the muscle from the bone as if they were butchering livestock. The lead poisoning had already rotted their minds, but the hunger had rotted their souls. Horror was no longer an emotion, it was the atmosphere. In the flickering light of the blubber lamps, the survivors sat in their tattered tents, their faces blackened by soot and frostbite, watching one another. Every cough, every stumble, every sign of weakness was an invitation. The men began to sleep with their knives in their hands, not to protect themselves from the Arctic, but from the person they had shared a mess table with for 3 years. The betrayal was total. They were no longer a crew, they were a collection of apex predators dying in a trap. They had begun to discard the sick, leaving them to freeze while still conscious, simply because a living body was too heavy to drag, and a dead one was a meal. The screams of those left behind followed the column for miles, a thin, high-pitched sound that the wind carried like a curse. The collapse was physical, moral, and absolute. The 28-foot whaleboats, once symbols of salvation, were now mobile charnel houses. Inside, the remaining men sat among the dismembered remains of their comrades, their eyes vacant and staring. The lead in their systems had induced a state of permanent psychosis. They saw visions of lush English meadows while they chewed on the leather of their own boots and the gristle of their friends' thighs. They were no longer moving toward a destination. They were just moving to delay the inevitable. The geography of King William Island had become a labyrinth of white despair. Every ridge looked the same. Every horizon was a lie. They were walking in circles, their tracks in the snow crossing over the footprints of the men they had been months ago, men who still had names and hopes. Panic finally set in when the meat began to run out. The group splintered into smaller, desperate factions. The officers, once the keepers of the law, were now the primary targets. They were the best fed, their bodies carrying more marrow and fat than the common sailors. Betrayal turned inward as the lower ranks realized that the gold braid on a sleeve offered no protection against a sharpened file. In the dead of night, the camp was filled with the sounds of muffled struggles and the wet thud of blunt objects. By morning, the group would be smaller, and the remaining men would have fuller bellies. There was no conversation. There were no prayers. God had abandoned the Arctic long before the ships had arrived. The only thing that remained was the relentless, driving need to consume. The point of no return was marked by the abandonment of the last boat at Terror Bay. 105 men had started the march. Now, fewer than 30 remained in this particular group. They were skeletal, their skin a translucent yellow-green from liver failure and scurvy. They had stopped burying the dead. The shoreline was a trail of bones, human femurs cracked open for the marrow, skulls with the tops sawn off. This was the final betrayal of their civilization. They had come to find a passage to the world, but they had only found the bottom of their own natures. The Arctic had stripped away the thin veneer of Victorian progress to reveal the shivering, starving animal beneath. They were no longer explorers. They were the evidence of a failed species. The hallucinations reached a peak. Men spoke to the thing that lived in the mist. They believed the ice was growing teeth. Some began to worship the very cold that was killing them, offering pieces of their own flesh to the wind in a desperate, insane bargain for warmth. The lead madness had turned the world into a surrealist nightmare. They saw the HMS Erebus sailing through the sky, its sails made of skin, its hull made of teeth. They followed these visions into deep snowdrifts and open leads of freezing water, disappearing without a sound. The group was shedding members like a dying tree sheds leaves. Each loss was an unspoken relief to those who remained. One less mouth to feed, one more body to harvest. The landscape itself seemed to react to their presence. The sun, which had not set for weeks, began to dip below the horizon again as autumn approached. The return of the dark brought a new kind of terror. In the shadows, the men saw the figures of those they had eaten, standing on the perimeter of the camp, watching with hollow eyes. The psychological pressure was a physical weight, crushing their chests until they could barely breathe. They were trapped in a loop of hunger and gore, a cycle of survival that had no exit. The betrayal of their humanity was complete. They had crossed a line that no rescue party could ever bridge. Even if they were found, they could never go home. They were no longer the men their wives remembered. They were monsters, born of ice and lead. As the first true winter storm of 1849 approached, the remaining handful of men reached a narrow spit of land. They could see the mainland in the distance, but the water between them was a churning mess of pancake ice and freezing fog. There was no way across. This was the final point of collapse. They collapsed into the sand and the snow, their bodies finally giving up the fight. They lay in a pile for warmth, a mass of rags and bone and filth. The betrayal was now silent. They waited for the person next to them to die. They watched the rise and fall of each other's chests with a predatory patience. The first one to stop breathing would be the last one to provide life. The transition to the final part of their journey was a descent into total darkness. The wind rose to a hurricane force, sand-blasting the exposed skin from their faces. The stars above were cold and indifferent, distant fires that offered no hope. They were 105, then 80, then 30, and now a mere handful of flickering lights in a world of absolute shadow. The horror had become their home. They no longer felt the cold. They only felt the void. The betrayal was finished. They had betrayed their God, their country, and their own nature. All that was left was the final, humiliating ending that the Arctic had prepared for them since the first day they had dared to sail into its heart. The last officer, his mind a shattered mirror of lead and guilt, crawled away from the group. He didn't want to be eaten. He wanted to die alone. He dragged himself behind a limestone boulder, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. He looked at his hands, black with frostbite, stained with the blood of his crew. He realized then that the expedition hadn't failed because of the ice or the food. It had failed because of them, because of the arrogance that had brought them here, and the hunger that had kept them alive. He closed his eyes and, in the silence, he heard the sound of footsteps in the snow, not the heavy boots of a rescuer, but the light, rhythmic padding of a predator. The ending was coming, and it would not be heroic. The end did not come with a prayer. It came with the sound of a silver fork scraping a human rib. By the spring of 1849, the Franklin expedition was a column of blackened, toothless scavengers. The arrogance of the British Empire was ground into the freezing mud. 129 men had set out to conquer the world, and now the last were dying in their own filth. Surrounded by the gold-rimmed china they refused to leave behind. The final moments were not heroic. They were humiliating. A slow, agonizing descent into the dirt where the only thing left of civilization was the metallic taste of lead in their blood. At the boat place, the horror reached its zenith. A dozen men crawled into a whaleboat, unable to drag it another inch. They lay in a tangle of limbs and rags, waiting for the cold. There was no conversation, only the wet, rattling sound of lungs filling with fluid. When a man died, the others did not mourn. They fed. They used naval saws to butcher the corpse, eating the heart and lungs first because they were soft. They were living in a charnel house on runners, a vessel of death stationary in a sea of white. The Victorian world was 1 billion miles away. Here, there was only the knife and the meat. The transition from man to animal was absolute. One of the last survivors was found years later by Inuit hunters. He was living in a hole in the snow, surrounded by the bones of his comrades. They did not see a great explorer. They saw a hollow-eyed demon who had survived by eating his own kind. He could not speak. His tongue was a black mass of scurvy and rot. He died in the dirt, clutching a piece of frozen human muscle. He was a pathetic end to the dream of the Northwest Passage. The final collapse was a matter of chemistry. Lead poisoning had reached its terminal phase. The last men suffered from total neurological failure, a state where the brain devours its own memories. Some were found dead in a sitting position, hands frozen to the handles of the sledges. They died still trying to pull their own coffins, the harness straps cut deep into skeletal shoulders. They spent their last calories moving a boat full of silver spoons toward a river they would never reach. It was a monument to the stubbornness of a dying empire. The last officer reached the mouth of the Great Fish River alone. The men he led were a trail of skeletons behind him. He stood on the edge of the mainland, eyes blind from the glare, lungs burning. He had reached the goal, but there was nothing. No post, no help, just an empty tundra. He did not scream. He sat on a limestone rock and opened his jacket to the wind. He watched his hands turn white, then black. He was the last witness to the greatest disaster in British history, and he took the truth to the grave. The ending was not a noble sacrifice. It was a messy, biological erasure. The bodies were not buried. They were dismantled by foxes. The Arctic did not care about medals. It treated their flesh like any other meat. Years later, search parties found the cannibal camp at Starvation Cove. They found skulls with telltale saw marks. They found pockets filled with useless trinkets, combs and locks of hair from wives who had long since moved on. The elite of the world had been reduced to a pile of gnawed bones in a nameless cove. The silence that followed the last breath was absolute. The ships, Erebus and Terror, succumbed to the ice. Pressure ridges finally won, crushing the wooden hulls and sending them to the bottom. They settled into the silt where light never reaches. Above, the Arctic continued its indifferent cycle. The sun rose over a landscape that showed no sign of the 129 men. The expedition hadn't just failed, it had been deleted. Only the wind remained, howling across the rocks, a sound carrying the echoes of 129 screams that no one ever heard. The story of the Franklin expedition is a verdict. It is proof that pride is a fatal weight. The 105 men who walked into the White did not leave a legacy. They left a warning. They showed what happens when a civilization refuses to listen to the land. They became part of the geography, their calcium leaching into the soil. They became a cautionary tale of the kabluna, who came from the sea and ate each other in the dark. There was no glory, only a cold truth frozen in the ice. In the final hours, the last man alive lay in the shadow of a capsized boat. He was surrounded by the debris of the 19th century, a shattered chronometer and a pile of human femurs. He looked up, but he didn't see God. He saw the cold. He saw the infinite weight of the atmosphere. He realized they were never masters. They were just intruders, small and fragile. He reached out a frost-bitten hand to touch the ice, his fingers turning to stone. The wind swirled the snow until he was just another mound on the shoreline. The ice moved. The wind screamed. The sun disappeared. The story ended where it began, in a white, unblinking silence that does not know the name of England. 129 souls were gone. The ships were ghosts. The bones were white. The Arctic was once again a perfect, empty mirror of the void. There was nothing left to find. The ice had won.